We urge you to vote con on today's resolution. Ethnic profiling is a just means of combating terrorism. Our first argument is that ethnic profiling is unproductive and inefficient. Our first subpoint is that ethnic profiling is not successful. Studies, notably one by the Proceedings of the National Academies of Science, have found that, quote, racial profiling has been no more effective than random screening in rooting out terrorists, as it, quote, keeps resting on the same innocent individuals who happen to have a large risk profile match value. We can see this through a plethora of examples, such as in 2004, when an anti-terrorism program using racial profiling investigated over 2,000 people, yet found no tangible results, and rather wasted the United States' valuable resources. Beyond inefficiency, by verbally affirming our nation's profile of a terrorist, we only help real terrorists to adapt and avoid holding such an appearance. This can be exemplified by the implementation of metal detectors in airports during the 1960s and 70s. While there was a decrease in the number of hijackings, terrorists soon adapted their methods, leading to a proportionally larger increase in other types of terrorist attacks, and thus a net increase of assaults. There is no set visual standard for a terrorist, as we can see from examples such as Ayad Akar's, an 18-year-old European-looking female suicide bomber in Israel, or Begin, a potential British terrorist who underwent plastic surgery in order to escape. Restricting investigations based solely on looks recognizes no concrete success, rather showing harm. Our second subpoint is that ethnic profiling is economically wasteful. Not only does ethnic profiling hurt anti-terrorist efforts, it also costs our government time and resources. For example, in 1998, when the U.S. Customs Service replaced security investigations based on race with those based on suspect behavior, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights states that, quote, this policy shift led to an almost 300% increase in the discovery of contraband or illegal activity, even though there were fewer searches conducted overall. Such high profiling costs can be explained by a few different reasons. First, Bu Habib notes that, quote, ethnic profiling would impose a higher tax burden than random investigation by requiring the identification of persons on the basis of their ethnicity prior to investigation. Secondly, as the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights report states, racial profiling, quote, ignores the possibility that someone who does not fit the profile may be engaged in terrorism, which would result in all invested money going to waste. In a world with finite resources, when less money is spent on one security tactic, more is put into another tactic. Thus, the cost inefficiency of profiling directly harms national security. Our second argument is that ethnic profiling alienates races, promoting discrimination. Our first subpoint is that ethnic profiling creates discrimination. By singling out racial groups as a threat to national security, profiling creates racial divides. The harms are multilateral. First, such discrimination is inherently immoral and harms equality. Profiling can lead to delays, wasting money and time, or the degradation of one's identity for reasons based solely on race rather than on legitimate factors. Secondly, such racism hurts cooperation with police and government. The Salon notes that, quote, New York's stop and frisk campaign in the late 1990s, when police were stopping people in the streets on a regular basis in an effort to confiscate legal weapons and reduce crime, created tension between the police and minority communities, who thought they were being unfairly targeted. This notes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Profiling would deter the targeted minorities, already noted for a tendency to commit crime, from trusting or respecting authorities, increasing crime in the long run and jeopardizing social contract between people and government. Our second subpoint is that accepting ethnic profiling for terrorism creates a standard tolerant of racial profiling overall. If racial profiling is allowed in one situation, it naturally sets a precedent to morally accept profiling for situations with smaller risks than terrorism, allowing moral offenses for few potential benefits. For example, in 1995, Lamberth surveyed Maryland highways and found black drivers constituted 17% of speeders, but 79% of those who were stopped and searched. And for these reasons, we urge you to vote con. Thank you.
All right, opponents ready? And all three judges? My partner and I affirm the resolution. Ethnic profiling is a just means of combating terrorism. Before we begin, we would like to make the following observations. Observation 1. Terrorists' main goal, by definition, is to instill fear for it ends. Observation 2. The use of ethnic profiling does not imply a reduction in any other screening methods, but rather is just an added tool to combat terrorism. Observation 3, the most just action is the action that has the least negative impacts. With those observations in mind, we offer the following 3 contentions. Contention 1, statistically reduces terrorism. Terrorism is often effective because it seemingly consists of random acts of violence, but the mathematics of the power law curve have shown that these acts are not truly random and often can be predicted. The math worked when applied to terrorist groups as diverse as the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, Peru's Shining Path, the Palestinian Intifada, Taliban insurgents in Afghanistan, and rebels in East Timor. Because these acts are not random, law professor John Banzoff has shown that applying the mathematical Goldilocks Principle to secondary searches at airports would substantially improve the likelihood that they would detect and stop a terrorist passenger trying to board. It would also speed up the process and reduce costs, he notes. Mathematically, this means it would be optimal to screen individuals in proportion to the square root of their presumed probability of risk. In other words, a group deemed to be 9 times as likely as the average traveler to be a terrorist would be subject to 3 times as many screenings. Banzoff offers this analogy for screening. Most women over 40 don't have breast cancer, and some younger women, as well as a few men, do. Nevertheless, we commonly focus our screening only on older women or those with other very high risk factors. Ethnic profiling offers the ability to improve our sample set while maintaining the values of other screening techniques. So ethnic screening is another tool to help us fight terrorism. Contention 2, decreases fear. The introduction of ethnic profiling would not only decrease the likelihood of an attack, it also decreases the fear of an attack. According to a Gallup poll, 71% of Americans support the idea of considering the ethnicity of a passenger as a potential sign of being a terrorist and a cause for very careful examination. Thus, if we were to implement these policies, similar percentages of Americans would feel safer. The impacts of this are threefold. 1, by reducing fear of terrorists, we inherently reduce the impact of terrorism because terrorism's main goal is to instill fear. 2, we improve our ability to think critically, such as about policy choices, according to Priscilla Lewis of the World Initiative. And 3, rational threat analysis is improved, continues Dr. Lewis. Contention 3, minimal negative impacts. Some may assert that the process of ethnic profiling will cause negative backlash, but that is only in the case of extreme and indiscriminate profiling. With the Goldilocks approach, there is nearly an unnoticeable impact to the individual, while maintaining the significant statistical improvement in terrorist detection. The standard you need to hold the con team to is, does any of their evidence about backlash or other negative impacts apply to this application of ethnic profiling? We need to be realistic about protecting our right to life while we strive to protect our rights to liberty and the pursuit of happiness. In fact, Professor Banzoff further states that ethnic profiling is constitutional if done in accordance with guidelines the United States Supreme Court has laid down. The court has frequently held that the government may consider race if it is reasonably necessary to further what the court has called a compelling state interest. My partner and I believe we have conclusively proven that there is compelling state interest, and thus if the governments that are responsible for upholding our civil rights deem something like this just, we say that ethnic profiling is a beneficial solution, not infringing upon our rights. For these reasons, we urge a vote in affirmation. Thank you. Yeah, I'm fine. I'm just grabbing.
Okay. All right. Should we go
Awkwardly get close together.
Okay.
All right, so your first question.
Okay. In your first contention, you're talking about the Goldilocks Principle, correct? And that's the square root method?
Yes.
Okay, this is done by William Press, correct?
It's done by William Press,
Okay.
Elaborated on by
Did you read the end of William Press's study?
I read the entire study.
Okay, where he says, quote, Press doesn't think so. Square root-based sampling, if it were somehow implemented, would limit profiling so much as to, quote, reopen the moral and ethical questions of whether the profiling is worth the social cost at all. Personally, he said, I would say that it is not.
Right, so he talks about the moral implications of it.
Right.
And so we're in this contention specifically, we're talking about the effectiveness, which not only Press and Banzoff agree with. But however, when we go on to our second contention, and our third contention, we talk about the actual moral implications of it. And this is where we prove that it's actually going to be moral because it upholds our rights.
So you're saying we're only looking at what Press says in this one paragraph and we're not looking at his conclusion at the end of his entire study?
Well, you just said that he personally wouldn't do it because this is the impact. However,
he says that the harms outweigh the benefits, which is your framework that you provide.
And the harms he specifically mentioned are all moral. However, when we look
we're
to
just ignoring morality, even though
no,
it says
I'm not. I'm saying
just.
he says he never constitutes why he thinks it's immoral. However, I'm in my entire next few contentions, I'm explaining why it is moral. However, his statistical analysis of the effectiveness is in fact.
If you're talking about your next two contentions, could I ask you a question about your second contention, please?
Please.
Okay, so you're basically saying people fear based on race, so we should continue this perception that people of other races are bad.
Well, the thing is, with the Goldilocks principle, you don't have an actual impact to the individual. So if you're not going to see, like, I don't feel more profiled or anything if I fit one of these ethnicities. However, the statistical improvement is still actually going to be a benefit.
I'm very confused. What I'm saying simply is you're saying that people already consider minorities scary, so we should.
I didn't say that. I said 71% of Americans support the idea of considering ethnicity. And it's been proven that when you actually take a study, certain people who possess certain qualities or certain ethnicities are more likely to be a terrorist. I'm not implying that everyone.
So we should only be worried about people not being afraid of these minority evil people.
Right, let's go on to my observation 2, which implies that there's no reduction in other counterterrorism efforts. This is just an added tool. So we're still going to have random screenings, which could account for the other problems.
Don't you think it's pretty bad to be promoting stereotypes?
I don't think I'm promoting stereotypes, because what I'm doing is with the Goldilocks principle, I'm not saying that, say, all Arabs should be screened. I'm saying that maybe it's Hispanics that have that higher percentage, or some other ethnicity. It's an actual statistical calculation.
So you're saying there are different types of races that could potentially be guilty?
Right. So
why should we use racial-based?
Because it's going to imply by what percentage we're going to increase the profiling. We're doing multiple ethnicities.
We already determined that the Goldilocks principle is immoral. This resolution is a question of morality, right?
I define a just means as one that has practical results as well.
All right, 25 seconds used. Opponents ready? Mm-hmm. Judges ready? Cameras rolling. All right, cool. So first timer went off. First, I'd like to start talking about our opponent's structure of moral framework in today's resolution. Our opponents say that we shouldn't look to morals, but instead net benefits in sort of a calculus based on justice in only terms of, actual effects, not in terms of the moral doing of any situation, right? We're not talking about the morals behind how we're doing something to someone. We're only talking about the net benefits of what we do to them. So in the case of what we're talking about in today's resolution, which is racial profiling, they say that the Goldilocks principle, which is a plan which is not really allowed in PF debate, is going to be the best solution. They say the Goldilocks principle is going to be predicated on the square root law, which is basically saying that a square root of the amount of times more likely someone is to do something is going to be the amount of times we are going to profile them. If such a legislation were to pass in the U.S. or any sort of country, that would necessarily become public. Because it's becoming public, you are still going to be biting into the impacts outlined in our last contention, which is basically that you are fostering a sense of stereotypes. You are basically increasing the acceptability in society of having these stereotypes, meaning it still bites in. The Goldilocks principle, they're trying to weasel out of that impact, but it simply can't be done. Similarly, they say that the scientist who conducted the study, the Goldilocks principle, which they cite, who said he did not support it, is going to only link to moral impacts, and that doesn't really matter. However, these moral impacts are predicated on its efficacy. Because it's not going to be 100% efficient, and because it's going to be profiling certain citizens more than others, that means that these people are going to have an unfair advantage. The fact that their own scientist doesn't agree with it on a moral level because it's going to be targeting the wrong people, not necessarily the wrong people, but in many cases it's going to be targeting innocent people, people who have no reason to be there, that is going to be a bad thing. You can't just ignore the moral impact of someone having, wasted time, possibly being arrested, possibly being detained for a prolonged amount of time in an airport. These are still bad things, tangible impacts, which on a moral level are more severe, but still are tangible impacts, meaning we link into both frameworks of moral justice and justice as they define it, which is just sort of utilitarian. Moving on to their second contention about decreasing fear. They basically say that the fear is basically all terrorism is predicated on, but they don't really link into how that fear comes about. If we have a less effective system, in our case we outline behavioral impacts and look into behavioral studies, that system is going to be more effective, 300% more effective. If we instead have this added system, which will have to take up resources. You can't say that there are going to be infinite amount of resources and we should only have as much as we possibly can, because you will have to choose at some point between having racial profiling and behavioral profiling. If you have the option to have more profiling, do it behaviorally. That is a better system. So that's where the argument lies. But looking to the decrease of fear, they say that it decreases fear because, people are going to be less scared. They're going to feel more safe when they go through airports because, hey, some people are being profiled. But if there's less effective profiling, that means more terrorism can happen. Because these impacts of actual terrorist attacks, the death of many citizens is going to be far greater in terms of creation of fear than what their impacts are, which is going to feel safe going through an airport. That means that we're outweighing on their level, saying that if we look to behavioral profiling, that's going to be more effective and going to stop terrorist attacks, which are clearly going to cause more fear than just traveling through an airport. Moving on to their third contention, they say that, basically having negative impacts is going to be mitigated by the fact that we're using the Goldilocks Principle. But this isn't necessarily true. Like I said earlier, they are not able to weasel their way out of the negative impacts we state. They simply say, only in extreme cases are any bad things going to happen. But because you're reinforcing a mentality of stereotypes, that's going to affect society negatively as a whole. You must look to the further impacts, not just the instantaneous impacts of one person being profiled. You must look to the societal acceptance of a stereotype used as the mechanism to distinguish between persons who are good and persons who are bad. And because they are unfairly treating certain persons based on their race and not on their behaviors as a bad person, this means they're going to be immoral and have negative impacts on society as a whole. And for these reasons, we urge you to vote con. Thank you.
Could I run about 45 seconds of prep time? Thank you. Thank you. Is everybody ready? All right, let's begin. First, looking to the framework of today's debate, which this entire productivity relies upon. First of all, yes, in fact, we should adopt a utilitarian perspective in this round because it simply makes the most sense for justification of society. We are asked here through the resolution to evaluate what the impacts of ethnic profiling is on terrorism. Terrorism is something that affects society as a whole. Therefore, if we can prove that ethnic profiling benefits society as a whole, not just a specific small group of people, we have proven that the overall justification for society exists. Oliver Wendell Holmes of Harvard explained this as early as 1911, saying laws are prescribed and techniques are prescribed for preserving safety of society for whatever is the most utilitaristically acceptable. Thus, we must look to utilitarianism for today's debate. Let's look to their specific contentions. What about their first contention, which said it is unproductive and unsuccessful? Specifically under their first point, what you can simply do is cross-apply the proof in our first contention that said it is statistically viable and morally acceptable. They bring up the point that Press, the author of our statistical proof, said, in fact, it is not morally acceptable. Well, Press was the person that came up with the idea that this might work. But Basnoff, Dr. Basnoff of MIT, the other person we cited, was the one that actually took Press's idea, put it into practice, see if it worked, and found out, in fact, it did. And he combined this with another theory, mathematical theory, called power law curve. And he's shown that both of these, when applied, can truly predict terrorism, that it is not random and amongst the races, and that it can be predicted on this mathematical basis. And Basnoff went on to continue that it is moral. So if you're going to look at it on balance, we have Press who came up with the idea saying it's immoral, Basnoff who's saying it's immoral. Maybe that's a moot point. But if we're determined whether or not it's moral, we look at the impacts. It has actually been applied in certain cases and successfully used. In Peru's Shining Path, the Palestinian Intifada, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, all of these mathematical techniques were applied to ethnic profiling and successfully used. So because it's successfully used in practice, we must say it's moral. Now, moving on to the explanation of their second impact of saying it explains economic finite resources. I would argue that this is non-topical because the resolution doesn't say assume there are finite resources in society. Of course, there are finite resources, but simple microeconomics explains we shouldn't assume that one thing will reducing one thing directly translates to an increase in another thing, or vice versa. Simple production possibilities curves, microeconomic theory, says specialized techniques are at more of an opportunity cost when we cause one thing to affect the other. So this whole second subpoint of economic efficiency is saying we're taking away from other more effective things such as behavioral conditioning. We can't assume that it's going to do that. Besides, the resolution is asking us primarily to assess this on a moral grounds, not necessarily a pragmatic grounds. But if you're choosing to assess this on a pragmatic grounds, you shouldn't even look to their economic analysis because it falls under production's possibility theory. Second of all, go to their point that says terrorists just simply adopt and change their ways and send like peoples of different ethnicities. Although this may be true, we can still see the benefit of ethnic profiling in identifying known terrorists. For example, Osama bin Laden couldn't just change his ethnicity out of the blue. Ethnic profiling is very effective at determining specifically who one terrorist is and catching that terrorist. In all gas stations, we see a little sign taped on the door of the height. What this means is if someone robs the gas station and runs out, the person can look at the height and calls the police and tells the height. It's common criminal practice to assume from people's profiles what they look like and to catch that specific individual. So we're not talking about overall general stereotypes, which brings me to their second contention about alienation. Ethnic profiling itself does not cause alienation, but rather it is the media that precipitates this. The concept of ethnic profiling doesn't inflict this at all. First, looking to the idea of the media, let me pull up my block right here. In the United States, The Economist has written that in the United States, the statistics reveal ethnic profiling can be used without causing the potentials of ethnic profiling and thus stigmatization. The Economist wrote that about the Transportation Security Administration, Islamophobia in the United States doesn't exist as much as it does in other countries without ethnic profiling. So you can see it's possible to implement ethnic profiling. It's just the media that overinflames it and causes the stigmatizations because they want to sell stories that make them money. It's not the idea, and thus you affirm. Thank you.
So I have a couple questions. Could I have the first one?
Yep.
All right. So these mathematical approaches to determining what statistically is going to be the best outcome, can they be applied to other things besides ethnicity?
Well, I'm not sure.
Like the power law.
I'm not sure, but I know that the ones that we explained, the power law was specifically developed for ethnic profiling.
Right,
so,
but can it be used? It is a statistic analysis, right?
I'm not a mathematician.
Okay, fine, never mind. I'll ask a different question. So in terms of microeconomics, you basically say, well, we should do both, right? Because there's no finite resources.
I'm just saying under the principle of the resolution.
So under the principle of which there are no finite resources.
You didn't let me answer that.
Okay.
I'm saying under what the resolution asks us to do, it doesn't say under the concept of finite resources this resolution is true.
Let's talk about
it. It just says on moral
principle. I get that.
Okay.
So in a microeconomic scale, let's say Tim is much better at repairing bicycles than changing a tire.
Sure.
But he can also change a tire.
Okay.
What should he do with his resources? He has as much time in the world, and he can do either one. Which one should he choose under a microeconomic theory?
I don't think we should decide that in today's debate.
But you brought up
because
microeconomics
I think this is
and
a
said
moral
that's the
debate.
best way to think about things.
All right,
in which case...
Anyways, let's move on. Could
right,
I ask you about your second contention?
Sure.
On alienation? All right, so we know the United States has used ethnic profiling since 9/11. The TSA memorandum say so. Let's look to the example of airports.
Many countries have used it.
Many countries use it. Why, in that case, is there not increased Islamophobia in the United States because of ethnic profiling?
There is increased Islamophobia.
Well, The Economist wrote there wasn't.
Right. The Economist is just one media source. You say the media.
A very authoritative one.
You actually said the media is the one that precipitates all of this negative impacts, right? All these things about
the media,
right?
as in like
you gave
TV sources.
One example of one media place, right? The
Can you give me an example?
Which is pretty reputable.
Okay. Could you give me an example of where it does precipitate ethnic?
My partner
conflicts?
might bring it up in the next case.
So
but
not right now.
basically, if we have media saying bad things, if you have legislation saying we should racially profile, and you have media, any kind of media saying bad things about that, spreading it throughout the world, I guess, is that going to be a good or bad thing?
I'm not sure what you're asking.
I'm saying is, if the legislation gets out that it's okay to think that Arabs are more likely to be terrorists than anyone else, and in fact that mentality spreads throughout the U.S. Is that good? Or is it bad?
All right. Well, as Basnoff of MIT writes and the former British Home Office writes, if a threat from a particular place is drawn to our attention and it only seems to come from this particular place, it makes sense that we devote a more proportional amount of our resources to combating it from that place.
But
so
is every person in the United States a doctor named Bazoff?
No.
Right. So they're not always going to think that, right?
So are you saying we should just look to what the most people agree with?
Do you think everyone will understand the statistical complications behind that? You yourself couldn't explain it to me. Do you think that every American, every person in the world will be able to understand it, or do you think that a stereotype
First of all,
arise?
I did explain it in my rebuttal speech. And
Okay,
second
then
of
what
all,
is the power curve?
And second of all, not everyone has to explain. Okay, I'll explain that in a minute.
Sure.
Not everyone has to understand the techniques that authorities use to stop terrorism. I don't understand how a gun works, but that doesn't mean I shouldn't support
the
a gun being
legislation
used
says
in
Arabs are
Afghanistan.
terrorists, right?
What's
That's
that?
what the legislation
No,
would
that
say.
isn't what the legislation says.
Well, it says, well, we should look to Arabs
The
first,
legislation says ethnic profiling may be a viable source. It doesn't.
Okay.
The legislation cannot itself specify a specific source.
cool.
That's why it's the media that's the problem, which specifies the source.
You. Do you have any explanation evidence on the power curve law? Like
Yes,
just-
absolutely.
okay.
Well, not with me.
Okay.
We can look at it after the round. I'll pull up the power curve evidence for you. Total of 1 minute 19 seconds used.
Opponents ready? Judges ready? Okay. So essentially this round comes down to two main points, the first of which is morality, the second of which is efficacy. On the issue of morality, our opponents begin by saying that we have a utilitarian viewpoint, but this is fine, but the fact is that morality still exists, especially if we are looking to the ends as they state. There is inequality in the ends they are simply ignoring. Now, they also state that they have a framework of whoever has the fewest harms, which is slightly different, but okay, in that case, our opponents provide no benefits unique to profiling, meaning that we have no harms to our side, yet we show unique negative effects on both moral and tangible grounds from their case. And the fact is that when it comes down to it, these two behavioral and racial profiling means they are mutually exclusive. So we must do what we're best at in order to excel. Now, moving on to efficacy, they state that a public fears minorities, so we should remove the people's fear. First of all, are they simply saying that we should promote racism? Fact is, government should be based on what the people need, not what the people want. And in this case, we need to give the people the lack of inequality that our opponents are actually offering. And on this point, we outweigh on the greatest harm of all, which is morality, and the fact that we need to treat all people equally, because that's the foundation of our country. Now, moving on about their Goldilocks principle, the fact is the author himself concluded the harms outweigh the benefits, and we link into their framework for the fewest harms. He says systems inefficacy could, quote, lead one to a decision not to profile at all. He claims Basanoff now, but then why is that not in use all over? The fact is because it simply does not work, as my partner brought up in the last cross-examination. Now, they also state that we can use it to determine one terrorist, but that's not racial profiling. That's simply identifying the terrorist, not just saying, oh, look, there's someone who's the same race, maybe it's him. They also state that we are living in a world with infinite money and we can't necessarily assume limited resources. This is simply not true. If we're taking any of our examples, they're being applied to the world as we have it today, and clearly the United States does not have infinite money. Now, finally, they drop our last subpoint, which is stating that by allowing this, it'll lead to only worse things for fewer benefits. And for these reasons, we urge you to vote con. Thank you.
All right, before I begin, I'm just going to give a brief roadmap. I'm just going to go over the main voter issues of today and say why I believe that Pro has won them. Opponents ready? And all three judges? All right. First, let's talk about it statistically reducing terrorism. Now, the first argument my opponents give to this is, well, William Press, the author of it himself, says that it's amoral. Well, the fact is, when we actually look to who actually put this into practice in airports and such, which is Basnoff, he said that it was justified, and it is working. We can see that it's working when we look at the FARC, the Shining Path, the Intifada, the Taliban, the rebels in East Timor, all these diverse groups, it's all working successfully. And when you're going to weigh things here, when we're decreasing terrorism, in these instances, you're saving lives. That's going to be the most powerful thing you're weighing in today's round. We're saving lives here. Now, in addition, the next argument, my opponents say you're going to alienate people. However, they never gave us an example of it working. And in addition, other countries that don't use ethnic profiling have a higher Islamophobe percentage. So it's really not, this isn't going to encourage further alienation, as evident in these other countries. In addition, my opponents say, oh, well, maybe legislation is going to cause this alienation. Well, legislation isn't going to say, hey, let's look at all Arab men and profile them at X percentage. The fact is, they're going to say, we're going to use ethnic profiling as is what is the most current percentage of each ethnicity, what is their most likely percentage to be a terrorist, and they're going to screen in those percentages. And they might not even be specified in legislation, leading to an actual noticeable alienation. And once again, let's go back to in practice, it doesn't cause alienation. In addition, when we go to the next area, which is moral, the government actually justifies this actions if it's in accordance with the compelling state interest, which we prove it is because it leads to the saving of lives. In addition, the implication in their second contention subpoint B, they never actually explained what the implications of this are, nor did they actually prove that it's going to happen. So you can't weigh this in today's round at all. And lastly, they completely dropped our second contention, which is on fear. They simply said that there was another better solution. However, it doesn't necessarily decrease behavioral screening because of macroeconomics. And because of this, I urge an affirmative ballot. Thank you. Sorry, are you guys ready?
Yeah, we don't need
So you guys going in the middle?
Me, we have the first question. Mm-hmm. All right, so where do you prove unique impacts as to a success?
Because you're gaining, you're decreasing terrorism, which wasn't actually able to be decreased.
Okay, where does it say that it wasn't able to be decreased by other mechanisms?
Basnoff in his studies, all right, we gave you 6 examples from the armed forces of Colombia, Peru, Shining Path, Palestinian Intifada.
You didn't really elaborate on these.
Talibanian insurgents in Afghanistan. In all of these instances, well, you just asked me what were the instances. These were the instances when this was used for ethnic profiling, when statistical Goldilocks Principle was used, and it worked.
Is it compared to anything else? Well, we're looking for unique benefits. We have comparative studies showing that other mechanisms are more successful. Okay. You're just saying it works, which, fine, it might work, but if it's not as successful as anything else, why should we use it when it has tangible harms to society?
Right, well, first of all, in PFD, you're not allowed to counterplan saying we should do this instead of this because we're just investigating the resolution principle.
We're saying other mechanisms exist, and because something so bad happens because of one, you shouldn't use it if others exist.
Well, first, we disagree that it is so bad, but second of all, once again, when we talk about you're not necessarily going to be taking away funds from, say, behavioral screening. You could be taking it away from anything. So we're not necessarily decreasing behavioral. This is just an added tool in the toolbox to help us combat terrorism, which is a huge impact.
In one random instance, in one airport, is there a chance that you could find a terrorist and chance you could not, right?
Yes.
Of course.
Okay, so when you're talking about these examples that prove successful for you claim, were they used in conjunction with other methods, or did they just use racial profiling?
Yeah, absolutely, as I mentioned a minute ago. Yeah, what they're doing is
do you have any causation linking specifically to this, if there's a chance in any case?
Yes, that's the whole point of these studies, was they were to determine if, sure enough, the Goldilocks Principle and ethnic profiling statistically is the causation for decrease in terrorism, and they thought it was.
What if that was the lucky time that behavioral...
Well, the fact that we gave you 6 instances, I think, shows it's not luck.
All right, but then still looking to unique benefits. At any given point in time, one person's not going to be able to do both, right?
Okay. All right. First of all, you're assuming there's either this or there's this, whereas in the world of economics, there's commonly 3 things. So what they could do is, let's say...
If you bring up the world of economics, microeconomic theory states that if you do something better than something else, you should always choose that first. And we give you statistics proving that. So do you really want to go down that path?
Absolutely. All right, here's why. Should I? Okay, so the principle, this ties into power curve. The principle of power curve says that we have three things. Let's consider, let's say, tax exemptions for farms, this counterterrorism strategy, and ethnic profiling. All right, in order to have both of the counterterrorism strategies increase in effectiveness, both of them at the same time, all we have to do is decrease one external factor, such as farms.
Power curve is a regressive analysis of statistics.
Using calculus at the tangent, yeah.
No, it's basically saying that, well, this percentage of people will lead to this percentage. All it does is prove the square root law to a certain degree. It does it a little more effectively, but all it does is regressively calculate what statistics are going to work.
Well, it seems to be working in the 6 instances we gave, which uniquely impact because
it doesn't uniquely.
Yes,
impact.
it does because the actual study it had it used ethnic profiling in order to compare it to other.
But you never gave us any of that information.
Okay, well I'll give it to you now. It's compared against other examples where you didn't use ethnic screening, and these were clearly more successful.
Thank you. So for this speech, I'd like to go over the implementation of racial profiling and the impacts of it. So first of all, we need to look to the benefits of racial profiling. Our opponents offer 6 exclusive cases, which they in no way compare to other forms of profiling. They do not give it any comparative measure towards behavioral profiling or even any other mechanism. We give one example of behavioral profiling. We gave it a direct comparison. The study showed that 300% more cases are going to be Sorry, that's a weird way of phrasing it. It's going to be 300% more effective if you look to behavioral profiling. Because we prove that there are alternative mechanisms that are more applicable, more effective, you have to look to those first. Because there are a finite amount of resources in the world, all of their examples are predicated on real-world examples, you have to look to what best uses these resources. If you don't buy that, look to the microeconomic theory. Microeconomic theory is saying that if you do something best, the most effective procedure is to do what you do best. Don't do something that's 30% less likely to 60% less likely to work, do something that will be more effective. So when you look to that, it shows that you're going to have unique benefits only on the con side, showing that there are behavioral ways of approaching it, there are other ways of approaching it that are going to be more successful. However, you can then look to impacts. They say, well, we're just adding something on. But this adding something on, one, is not offering unique benefits and has negative harms. First of all, it creates a mentality of racism. We've been saying it again and again. They've just been sort of not acknowledging it with one Economist article. But because racism will still exist, the stereotype will still exist, that's still a negative impact. However, we also say that it's not as effective, and that's a harm. Not only is it not going to be as effective just because it's just being added on, and that means it's ineffective, and that takes out the first point, but because it's not effective, that leads to more terrorism. If you're looking to that instead of something else, that will lead to more fear, which again, it links right back into their case, saying we should mitigate this amount of fear. However, our last point, which is in our first contention, is about adaptation. Because these terrorists are going to be able to adapt to a profile, they're not going to always be caught. In fact, they'll probably be less likely to be caught because they're going to be able to see exactly what people are looking for and avoid that. For all these reasons, we show that negative impacts outweigh the benefits, and we urge you to vote con. Thank you.
Can I take the remainder of my prep time, which is very small? It's like 25 seconds, I think. Is that right? I think so. Okay, thank you. For a very brief roadmap, I'm just going to go over voting issues in today's round. Is everyone ready? All right. Of course, what this all boils down to is our uncontested framework that our opponents chose to drop and which we accept for the round, utilitarianism. Does this benefit the most number of people? Are the rights of more people, and such as the right to safety, preserved through perhaps the loss of the rights to a fewer number of people? Just simply because this wasn't rebutted, this is what should stand in the round. So let's look how the pro upheld this today. The first independent reason you're going to be voting pro today is our fear argument. We showed that regardless of whether or not it actually works, regardless of whether or not ethnic profiling actually decreases terrorism, when it is enacted, people perceive less threats. The whole point of terrorism, by definition, as we stated from the very beginning, is to cause fear. So since ethnic profiling decreases fear, it's going to decrease terrorism inherently, just by definition. They failed to rebut this except for one sentence in their last speech, in the last final focus speech, which I'm not allowed to rebut in this speech. So this holds through. You don't need any other reason, just for the fact that the fear argument exists. Ethnic profiling, according to our Gallup poll, 71%, as we stated in our constructive case, which my partner brought up in the summary speech. Indeed, it does decrease fear. So this is a reason. Second, the alienation contention. What happens because of ethnic profiling? The concept of ethnic profiling can alienate a specific group of people. Perhaps it could incur alienation later on because of external factors that choose to use the principle, which is all we're investigating today, in practice. But even if you don't buy that and you choose to take a pragmatic approach, we showed you how in countries that do use ethnic profiling, such as the United States, there is less alienation than countries that don't use ethnic profilings. Our opponents, the only rebuttal to this was they said, well, do you have a case that contrasts to this, and did you examine both sides? Well, they didn't offer evidence that negates what we said, so what we said still stands. Alienation doesn't happen in ethnic profiling. And the last one is the prevention of terrorism. We have explained how the MIT, through Basnoff, who says it is moral, and the press's idea was incorporated in 6 independent instances, and unlike our opponents claimed, these instances compared ethnic profiling to instances where there were none. We explained this from the beginning. That's the whole point of these instances and the whole point of these investigations, and concluded empirically that ethnic profiling can be used effectively in determining terrorists through the power curve principle and through the Goldilocks principle. So we've given you 3 independent reasons that are all utilitarianistically based to vote pro. Thank you.
Again, I just want to thank you guys for giving for this debate. I thought it's a very difficult topic, and I thought there were great points on both sides. That being said, I thought that Pineview's argument of utilitarianism was more powerful than Hunter's idea of kind of morality. In particular, I was taken by the idea that the media is a greater purveyor of these negative stereotypes. And so for that reason, I picked Pineview. And just a brief comment, I think both sides' arguments could be more powerful if they avoided getting kind of bogged down in the microeconomic and academic minutia of the arguments. So thanks.
I also want to thank the debaters for coming today, because I realize at the end of the school year it's more problematic to come to these events, particularly if you've already graduated and looking towards your summer vacation. After reflecting on the presentations and the debate, I have awarded the win to Pineview, primarily because I think they excelled in their debating techniques. In particular, in the final crossfire, they managed to provide excellent answers to all the questions that Kahn raised, and they wrapped up the case in a bow in their final focus with very strong restatements of their contentions and rebuttals of Kahn's arguments.
I also wanted to congratulate the debaters both for showing up today and for doing a great job. I mean, you guys were fluent and spoke smoothly and clearly, and so you were all great speakers. I also went for the win with Pineview, representing the pro position. And for me, it came down to near the end when the con side asked us to look at which side uses resources the best, because that seems to me like a straightforwardly utilitarian argument which presupposes the framework offered by pro. I mean, con says that we're going to create a mentality of racism if we allow for ethnic profiling, which is immoral, but then says if there's another method that can accomplish the same goals, then we should take that method. But it tacitly assumes that if we don't have any other method of getting to the same goals, then we can tolerate the use of ethnic profiling, which seems to suggest that ethnic profiling can be justified in combating terrorism. So, I mean, I want to go along with what some of the earlier judges said about I don't know why both sides began to get bogged down in David Ricardo and comparative advantage. I never expected to encounter microeconomics in a debate over ethnic profiling. But I ultimately was swayed to go with a utilitarian framework to consider who won this round, because I think Pro from Pineview straightforwardly grasps that philosophical bull by its horns when Speaker 4 gave his first speech by opening saying, look, we want to adopt a utilitarian framework, and on that framework I think they win the round. And Con sort of tacitly went along with that near the end, which I think is where the debate was finally closed.